What was it like to be a slave in ancient Rome? The answer is difficult to determine, but one thing is clear: it was a life unlike any other. Being a slave in the ancient world was akin to being part of an assembly line or just another cog in the machine of daily life. Slaves were treated as property and were expected to work tirelessly for their masters without complaint or question. Their lives were hard, and their living conditions reflected this fact. Although some slaves were able to acquire their own freedom through various means, including buying their freedom, the vast majority lived out their days as mere chattel. So in today's video, we're going to explore some more about the lives of slaves in ancient Rome. But before that, please do not forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Thanks, and let's get started. Slavery was part of Roman life from the start. The Romans were practical people, and they saw no reason to waste time or money on things they could simply buy or make. Slave labor was the most efficient way to carry out all kinds of work in an empire with such diverse needs. From building roads and aqueducts to harvesting crops and tending livestock, slaves were used for just about everything you could imagine: construction work, farming labor, domestic services like cleaning homes and cooking meals for their masters or mistresses, even as soldiers in times of war. Some slaves became wealthy enough through hard work that they eventually purchased freedom. Others committed crimes against their masters or mistresses, who used them as punishment instead of sending them away from home. And sometimes those punishments were literally death sentences. The journey took days, weeks, and even months in some cases. Slaves were often chained together by their necks and forced to march in huge numbers through all kinds of weather and terrain. Some slaves suffered from exposure and starvation on these journeys, while others had their feet cut off so they couldn't run away from their masters. In early Rome, most slaves were prisoners of war and were often treated very well. Slavery was a common part of Roman society. It was not uncommon for slaves to be treated better than many people in Rome, including free citizens, soldiers, and women. Slaves were often given better food than the average citizen and were trained in fighting so that they could protect their masters if needed. They could also be given an education so that they could work as tutors or secretaries, positions that only citizens could hold before the 1st century CE. They were separated from their families and loved ones. Many slaves were taken from their homes and families by pirates who kidnapped them and sold them to slave traders. The slave traders then marched hundreds of miles across North Africa, where they were packed like sardines into the holds of ships bound for Rome. During this treacherous journey, many slaves died from disease or starvation. Once they arrived at their destination, slaves were auctioned off to the highest bidder at one of 4 Roman markets: Ostia Antica on the Tiber River, Portus near modern-day Civitavecchia, Fidenae near Rome, or Lavinium, where ancient Latium met with Etruria. At these markets, dealers would inspect each individual for signs of physical weakness or illness. If any such sign was found on a slave's body, he or she would not be allowed to be purchased as a worker, instead of being condemned to death as unfit for labor. Those who passed inspection became the property of whoever bought them. But even after reaching their new master's home, they were still forced to depend on him or her for their food and shelter, and thus could never truly be free again. For foreign slaves, their entire way of life was taken from them. They were forced to live in Rome and eat Roman food. They were not allowed to speak their own language or practice their own religion. Their masters could do whatever they wanted with them, including sell them as slaves for other things. The Romans didn't have a rigid system of racial distinctions between slaves, although they did recognize distinctions between ethnic groups. If you were a slave in Rome, you weren't considered to be of a different race. Slaves were considered to be of a different class, which meant that even if you were born into slavery and your parents and grandparents had been slaves, you still could become free. While this was rare, it did happen from time to time. The Romans didn't have such clear racial distinctions between slaves as we do today. However, they did recognize ethnic differences between their conquered peoples and those who came as free immigrants or traders, like Greeks. One example is that Greeks often became teachers of literature and philosophy in Roman society because they had access to higher education back at home, but not in Italy at the time. There were Roman slaves in every type of job. Slaves were used to do all kinds of jobs. If you were a Roman, you could be a slave if you didn't have land or money. Slaves worked in the fields, mines, and factories. They also worked in the houses of rich Romans as servants and maids. Even some people who had land or wealth became slaves. People whose debts they couldn't pay might be sold into slavery by their creditors, who would then use them as laborers until they could pay back what they owed. Slaves could also be captured during war or taken as prisoners of war, perhaps even sold by their own people and forced into slavery until they died there. Some slaves tried to escape, but few succeeded. Slaves who tried to escape were punished by death. However, since few slaves had any money or possessions, they couldn't do much except try and run away. If they were caught while trying to escape, their punishment was usually death or torture. Some Roman slaves did manage to escape their masters' houses nonetheless. One example is Spartacus, circa 109 BCE to 71 BCE, who managed to lead a group of escaped gladiators out of Rome's city limits and into the countryside, where they started an army against Rome's army, with other runaway slaves from different parts of Italy, as well as some free men that joined them as soldiers on their side. Spartacus War. Slaves had no rights or standing in society. Slaves were property and could be bought or sold at any time. They had no rights or standing in society. Moreover, their lives were often brutalized by their owners. They were treated as property rather than people. Slave owners were cruel and often brutalized their slaves. Slaves were treated like animals, and the Roman slave owner was the master of all. Slaves were property, and their masters could do whatever they wanted to them. A common practice was to beat slaves for any reason or no reason at all. This was considered acceptable behavior since it wasn't hurting anyone but the slave, but that doesn't make it right. The Roman slave owner made sure his slaves worked long hours in harsh conditions for little pay in order to maximize profits from their labor. Some people think that because slavery has been abolished everywhere today, we can say that our society is free of this kind of exploitation. But we still have people working long hours under harsh conditions with little pay, just so others can get richer faster than they would otherwise be able to do so on their own merits alone. Slaves could buy their way out of slavery very easily. In ancient Rome, slaves did not have to wait for their masters to free them. They could buy their own freedom if they were able to earn enough money. The Roman law of emancipation provided a way for slaves to escape from their servitude and become free citizens. The basic requirements were that the slave had served his master for 4 years, was no longer a minor, 16 years old, was sound in mind and body, and had paid his owner 200 denarii, equivalent to $3,000. If an owner wanted his slave to be freed prematurely because he was an educated professional or artist who could make more money working on his own than as a servant, then it cost 500 denarii, equivalent to $7,000. Once a slave became emancipated, he was no longer obligated by law, but he still owed respect and obedience to his former master, unless there had been some kind of abuse involved during slavery that would have caused him or her not to be able to stand living with them anymore, so escaping may have been necessary at times during those years. Especially when having kids or wives makes things even harder, when trying hard enough just right now being free again after all those years spent working hard off debt. Being back onto another one before too long starts happening where they're already too old now, so no matter what happens next, they'll never get out of debt ever again. Although many Romans did view their slaves as mere property, others began to think of them more like children. The most famous example of this was Cicero's relationship with his slave Tiro. Though he treated him well and gave him his freedom after his death, this was not typical for a Roman master. On average, mortality rates were high for slaves, who often worked in harsh conditions and were susceptible to diseases such as malaria or smallpox. Slaves had a high mortality rate. The average lifespan of a slave was between 30 and 35 years old, but this number could be affected by their treatment and the type of work they did. Slaves who were forced to work in harsh conditions or long hours were more likely to die earlier than other slaves. Slaves often worked under dangerous conditions, such as mining or construction sites, where they were exposed to toxic fumes and dust particles that would damage their lungs over time. If a Roman citizen owned slaves who worked outside during the warmer months, he would need to supply them with fresh water frequently throughout the day, even if it meant using up most of his supply for himself. In ancient Rome, it was dangerous to be anyone other than a wealthy citizen if you wanted to live with some form of dignity. As a slave, you would have no rights or stand in society. Your owner could buy and sell you at any time, and there would be no one to help you if your master decided to mistreat you. Slaves were taught from an early age that the only way they could survive was by serving their masters faithfully without complaint. The treatment of slaves varied widely depending on the type of work they did. Some slaves worked on farms or in homes as domestic servants. Others were trained for more specialized jobs like blacksmiths or carpenters. Some even became physicians when their owners provided them with the necessary training and tools. We hope that after watching this video, you have a better understanding of the life of a slave in ancient Rome. It's important to remember that people who lived thousands of years ago were not so different from us today, except perhaps in their level of technology and lack of modern medicine. They had hopes and dreams just like we do, and lived with many similar fears as well, such as being captured by an enemy army or being sold into slavery. We need to take care not to forget what it was like for those who lived during this time period, because they are part of our history just as much as anyone else. If you have any questions, feel free to leave a comment below, and don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel for more videos like this one. Thanks for watching!